lesson all about the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. So last week we started looking at some Viking invasions, and we talked about the Anglo-Saxons, and we talked about the fact that the Anglo-Saxons came after the Romans, and they sort of had not one united kingdom, but lots of different kingdoms, and we're going to look a bit more about that today. And that at the same time, during this period, the Vikings started invading, and we started our very first lesson by thinking about whether our interpretation of them being scary, kind of pillaging, violent, aggressive people was fair, or whether some of them were actually explorers and adventurers, and you all had lots of really different ideas. Now today we're going to look at the Anglo-Saxons. There is lots of, one thing I'm going to say before we even start is there's lots of different dates. So you might look at a king and it might tell you lots of different dates. And the stories or the theory slightly change. So the spellings of the kings and rulers are different. And that's because obviously we don't have a significant amount of written records. But that's what we're going to start looking at. So hello to everybody I can see who is watching on Facebook and on YouTube. Hello to Eleanor and Jack and Rose and Willow and Caden and Peter and June and Noah and Phoebe and Oliver and Matthew and Nathaniela and Aaron and Sophie and Nathaniel and Melissa and Benji and Sam and Rose and Edith, everybody who watches on Catch Up, everybody over on YouTube, and let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to ask is, do you know anything about Anglo-Saxon kings? Do you know the names of any of the Anglo-Saxon kings? Do you know any of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms? So there wasn't just one kingdom. Do you know any of the kingdoms? Or is there anything in particular that you'd like to know about the Anglo-Saxons? You know, have you always thought, oh, well, actually, I'd quite like to know this, or I'd quite like to know that? Do you know? So someone said Alfred, that they know that there's King Alfred. Someone said that they know that one of the kingdoms was Wessex. Actually, the second answer for Wessex. So absolutely, there were lots of different kingdoms. But Wessex was the last one to kind of remain against the Vikings. So yeah, absolutely. Anybody know anything else? Absolutely fine. If you know nothing. Was Harold one of the kings? Yes, towards the end. We've got Harold, and his demise leads to the end of the Anglo-Saxons and the start of the Normans. Canute, absolutely, he's another one. So there's lots and lots and lots of various different kings, but Canute actually wasn't an Anglo-Saxon king, although he ruled over the Anglo-Saxons, but he was actually a Viking. King Arthur. Well, that would be lovely if it was King Arthur, but that is kind of a bit of a legend. So what we're going to do is we are going to play a Athelstan. Absolutely, that's another one. We're going to play a game, and the game is going to be, is this a real name or is this a made-up name? So that's what we're going to play. So was this a real Anglo-Saxon ruler, or was this a made-up one? So that's what we're going to look at first. So the first one is King Egbert. Now, do you think that that's a real name, King Egbert, or do you think I've made that up? So we're going to say real or fake. Oh, so lots of you saying, some of you are saying real, but most people are saying it's fake. I think that's probably the most fake ones. Well, I have to say it's not made up. It is a real name. So well done. There was an Anglo-Saxon king called King Egbert. The next one, King Offa. That's a strange name, Offa. What do you think? Do you think King Offa is a name, real name? Or do you think I've made that one up? King Offa. Hello, Offa. How are you? Are you having a good day, Offa? I think that's a real one. Jack says it's real. Rose says it's fake. Fake, fake, fake. Real, fake. Oh, fake. It's a really interesting one, isn't it? All right, Offa. It's actually another real name. So they had really different names. Yeah, we don't often hear the word name Offa. Right, now King Athelstan. Now, can you see that this has a funny kind of letter at the front? Does anybody know what this is? This isn't a sound that we use today. It's like a mix of an A and an E. And you know, I said to you that sometimes you see kings written with different spellings. This is how most people would spell it. So it could say Athelstan, or it could say Ethelstan, but it doesn't actually say either. Does anybody know what that sound, that phonetical sound is when you put the A and the E together? And do we think this is a real king? Well, somebody's already said that Athelstan, so you kind of are already a little bit more in the know. So Matthew says it's real. Lots of you are saying it's real. It absolutely is. But let's think of our phonics. Does anybody know what phonetical sound, if you're looking at Anglo-Saxon and you ever see an A and an E squished together, it makes a sound that we don't use anymore. You certainly don't use it. So someone says we have the same in French with a C and an E. Does anybody know what the sound is? If not, I shall tell you what the sound is. It's a sound we don't use today. It's not oo, but it's a good guess. It's not O. It's a sound we don't actually have. Any idea? Shall I tell you? It makes the sound ash. So it's actually Ashlalstan. But we don't actually have ash as a sound anymore. So if you're reading Anglo-Saxon and you see an A and an E and they're squashed together, it makes the sound ash. But we have A and A, and E, I and I, O and O, and E and E. So we have those vowels and they either make a short or a long sound. But in Anglo-Saxon, they had a further sound which made the sound ash. Absolutely ash. But it wasn't obviously spelt like ash. It was just spelt with an A and an E squashed together. So it actually says Ashlalstan. Far harder to say, but he's a real king. Now, again, someone's already said King Canute. So you're almost one step ahead of me. King Canute was definitely a real king. But as I've said, he was actually a Viking or a Danish king. And he wasn't an Anglo-Saxon king, but it is a real king. Right. What then about King Harthacnut? Think that sounds like a real king? Harthacnut? Sounds like you're a bit of like a Harthacnut. Harthacnut, what do we think? Surely I'm making that up. Hi, Harthacnut. It's quite a long word to say. Someone saying true. Lots of you saying true. Some of you saying fake and made up. Shall I tell you? It's true. King Harthacnut, it was a real king. King Edward. What do we think? King Edward. Do you think this is too normal? Do you think King Edward was a king during this period? What do we think? Lots of you saying real. Absolutely. If you've ever heard of Edward the Confessor, he was the last stable king, and it was his death that kicked off the Battle of Hastings. So absolutely. So well done. Now we're going to think about the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon Britain, because the Anglo-Saxons weren't one big kingdom. They were actually lots of different kingdoms. So if you've ever done the Greeks with me, you'd know that we talked about there are lots of kind of states, and it was a little bit like that in Anglo-Saxon Britain. There were lots and lots of different kind of states or little kind of mini kingdoms or kingdoms. So there wasn't just one Anglo-Saxon Britain. Now a few of you have already said you know Wessex, but there are a few others. Does anybody know any of the other Anglo-Saxon Britain kingdoms? Does anybody know? any of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms? So there's definitely Wessex. The other thing is, do you know which area of Britain these kingdoms were kind of roughly geographically based? Ireland wasn't an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, but well done for having a go. Any other ideas? Sussex, Wessex, Essex. Lots of you saying that you like horrible histories. Do they have the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon Britain on there? I'm not sure. York. Now, York's a city, definitely was part of one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, famously then became part of the Viking kingdoms. Mercia, amazing. Essex again, brilliant. Right, shall I show you? So the Northumbria, well done. So Northumbria. So these are the names of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So we have Wessex, Northumbria, and Mercia, and they were the top three biggest, greatest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And then we have East Anglia, Kent, Essex, and Sussex. So those are the main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And we've talked about the Anglo-Saxons were settlers. They were from Europe. They were sort of known as Angles and Saxons, but they were from various what we would call Germanic tribes, so from areas sort of around where Germany and places like that are today. But there were different types of Anglo-Saxons found in different parts of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So if you look at Wessex, Wessex were mainly settled by Saxons. Northumbria and Mercia and East Anglia were mainly settled by Angles. In Kent, they were settled by the Jutes or the Jutes, and Essex and Sussex were also Saxon. So again, that is why we tend to have these different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, because they were actually settled by invaders that were from different Anglo-Saxon, original Anglo-Saxon Germanic tribes. And if you look geographically, so Kent and the Jutes, if you go and look where the Jutes were based, and you go and look where the Angles were based and where the Saxons were based, that's kind of part of if you then got in a boat and sort of sailed over to invade Celtic Britain, you kind of have your idea of why there are all these different tribes, because they're made up of different original tribes. So we have the Romans start to exit, the Celts obviously are still living alongside the Romans, and the Anglo-Saxons start to invade from areas roughly geographically where Germany is today. And that's the reason there's different kingdoms, because they are invaded and taken over by different Germanic tribes, the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes. And that's why we use Anglo-Saxon. And it's a bit sad we don't say Jutes, so we should really be calling it the Anglo-Jute-Saxon Britain. But obviously, as some of you have worked out, the Jutes were only found in Kent. And that's why you have these different kingdoms. Now, what area of Britain are we talking about? So roughly, Wessex was Hampshire, Dorset, Somerset, and Wiltshire. So the modern counties geographically today. Northumbria was Merseyside, Lancashire, Cumbria, Yorkshire, Durham, Tyne and Wear, and Northumberland. Mercia was Staffordshire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, Warwickshire, and the West Midlands. East Anglia was Norfolk and Suffolk, which is kind of the humpy bit of England. Kent is Kent, which hasn't changed, and is that. So if you live in Kent, your county name has continued from Anglo-Saxon times, and it's where the first Anglo-Saxons were thought to have landed. And then in Essex, you have Essex, Herefordshire, and Middlesex. And then in Sussex, you have East and West Sussex. So again, if you're in Essex or you're in Sussex, then you would know again, your county name has continued from Anglo-Saxon Britain. Now, one of the questions is, well, what about everywhere else? So places like Cornwall and Devon remained Celtic, and other areas. So you can look at the map, you can see the map. This is roughly how it was all kind of portioned up. And you can see that some areas of Cornwall and Devon and parts of Somerset and a little bit of Hampshire, a little bit of Dorset rather, is still kind of Celtic. Wales still, and Scotland still held by the Celts. And that is why, although everywhere was Celtic, that is why often the Welsh and the Cornish and the Scottish talk about their Celtic heritage, because they continued and held on to their Celtic heritage for a lot longer than the rest of the country, the rest of Great Britain, because they were areas that weren't invaded by the Anglo-Saxons. So although we were all Celtic at one point, the Anglo-Saxons had a massive impact on most of England, but obviously Cornwall, Devon, a bit of Dorset, and Wales and Scotland continued and held on to their Celtic heritage. And that's why you often hear the Cornish and the Welsh in particular talking about being proud of their Celtic heritage, because of that reason. So hopefully that gives that idea. But basically each of these areas, so Mercia had a king, Northumbria had a king, Wessex had a king, and each area had their own king. They had their own army, and as I've said, they were continually fighting with each other. So they were continually fighting amongst each other. This was quite an aggressive and violent time, which is why we looked at last week. It wasn't fair just to say that the Vikings were the only ones. Now, by AD 878, there was only one kingdom left, and that was Wessex. And lots of you were talking about King Alfred, and that's King Alfred the Great. And the reason behind that is because all the other kingdoms had been overrun by the Vikings, who established their own kingdom. So the Vikings came over and settled, and the last remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom was Wessex. And then the history gets very, very much sort of messy, because we kind of flip between having some Anglo-Saxon kings, and we have some Viking kings like Canute in charge, and then it all gets a little bit messy, and then we end up having just sort of one king of the Britons, because the history sort of evens out, so that by the time we see the end of the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings in Britain, when the Normans invade. So it's quite a complex history. Someone's saying, I'm a Celt. I'm a Celt too. I'm from Cornwall. But yeah, that is the reason often why those people are quite proud of that Celtic heritage. But yes, different kingdoms and different kings. So what we're going to think about is some of the Anglo-Saxon kings obviously tried to fight against the Vikings, and King Alfred the Great is one of those kings. So he was the king of Wessex, and the interesting thing about King Alfred is he's the only king, and he's the only British monarch, he's the only king and the only queen to ever be given the name Great. So there is no other king or queen in the whole of British history that ever has been given the name Great afterwards. So he is known as King Alfred the Great, which led me to think, what qualities would make you great? What do you think you need to have in order to be a great ruler or a good ruler? Because the kings in those days had complete control. So the King of Wessex, complete control. So what they said, goed. There was goed. What they said, went. That's better English. There was no parliament. They might have a few friends that they got advice from and some advisors, but what they said went. So if you were living in Wessex or Mercia or Northumbria and you had a king, what qualities would make them good? What do you think Alfred had to make him get this title Great? What do you think? So Rose says that they have to listen to people's ideas, that you have to protect your people, that you make sure your people have access to food and water, that you're a good communicator, that you offer safety. Eleanor thinks they should be kind. Absolutely, that's important. What else do we think? Make sure that any settlements that you make with others are good. Is there? There's a mushroom called King Alfred cakes. Well, I've never heard of that. I'll look up that. Thanks for sharing. Brave, honest, kind, says Jack. Providing for your people, being nice, being a good leader, providing safety, being brave, helping animals from Almanzora, listening to people, providing a safe settlement. Absolutely, I think you've pretty much got all the ones that I was thinking of. Taking care of people if they're sick, absolutely. I was thinking someone who was fair. So someone who was fair, someone who listens to others, someone who's intelligent. That's one that I don't think anyone said. Okay, so not being bossy, but you also kind of do have to be a bit clever, because I think it would be hard. Someone who's good with money, someone who can protect the kingdom, someone who's merciful. So lots of you said fair and kind and sort of friendly, someone who's kind, someone who's brave, someone who protects the weak. So what I would like you to do is run and get if you want to, you don't have to, run and get a scrap piece of paper and a pencil. Because what we're going to think about is we're going to look at some rulers of Anglo-Saxon Britain. We're going to look at Athelstan or Athlan. We're going to look at Aethelflaed. We're going to look at Edward the Elder, and we're going to look at Alfred the Great. And what we're going to do is we're going to make can you see this? This is kind of a little bit like a graph. However, it's not really a maths graph. What I'm going to do is, if you've got a scrap piece of paper, I just literally want you to do an X and a Y axis. And up the side, I want you to write 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10. And down the bottom, I couldn't fit it down the bottom, but down the bottom, you can write Athelstan, Aethelflaed, Edward the Elder, and Alfred the Great. And what we're going to do is I am going to tell you some evidence about each of these rulers. And if at the end, you are going to decide whether or not you think they were a great ruler. And if you think they were really great, okay, you are going to do a little kind of smiley face next to like number 10. So if we do, you've got Athelstan at the bottom, and if at the end of Athelstan you think, yeah, he was awesome, you're going to put like a little smiley face next to 10. If he was fairly good, might mark him at like an 8. If you kind of think of like a bit average, you would do like a kind of sort of one of those emojis. It's a bit like, you know, with the straight mouth, by 5, if you think they were kind of average. If you think they were a bit below average, you might mark them at like a 3. And if you think they were totally rubbish, you're going to do like a really sad emoji kind of by 0 or 1. Hopefully no one gets 0. Now, don't forget, it's history, so it's entirely up to you what you decide. You would just need to support it with evidence. The key word that I always use is interpretation. Now, at the end, once we have plotted our 4 Anglo-Saxon rulers on our graph, if Alfred the Great truly deserves the title Great, he will be right at the top of our graph. Okay, does that make sense? So we're going to start with Athelstan, Aethelflaed, Edward the Elder, Alfred the Great, and for each one you are going to plot them on your sort of, you know, don't need to be like all posh. You're going to plot them on your graph. Okay, so we're going to go with Alfred first, because I think we should start with the great Alfred the Great. Was Alfred the Great great? So the reason that the evidence I've got for you to decide about Alfred is that he was incredibly brave, and he was one of those rulers that didn't sort of sit on his horse at the back of a battle and go, go on then, chaps, off you go. He was supposedly so brave, he would charge into battles like a wild boar, and he was absolutely not going to be pushed over by any Vikings. And he famously overcame the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. Okay, so that's the first thing about Alfred. The other thing was he was the first Anglo-Saxon king to actually defeat the Vikings. All the other kingdoms failed to defeat the Vikings, which is why Wessex was the last kingdom to survive. Okay, so he gave his people peace. He protected them from the Vikings. They were really, really frightened about Viking invasion, and he protected them. The other thing was he was really clever. So he knew he couldn't remove the Vikings altogether. They were starting to settle around him. And so basically, he made a deal with one of the Viking rulers and said, do you know what? If you just leave us alone, you can control the northern side of Britain, and you just sort of keep, we'll just keep Wessex, and also we'll have this little bit of West Mercia and Kent. So we'll just draw a line, and you can have the northern part of England, and we'll just have Wessex, West Mercia and Kent, and we'll kind of do a deal. And that's why that area became known as Daneland, because it was a Dane law. So that's the other thing he did. The other, which gave his people peace. And then he believed education was really important. So lots of books at the time, there weren't many, but they were pretty much all in Latin. So he started to say, we need to, any texts that we've got, we should translate to English. And he also started setting up some schools for normal people to try and learn. So although it wasn't, mass literacy, it was quite, I can't think of the word, but, revolutionary at the time. So you're going to plot Alfred the Great on your map, on your graph. Out of 10, do you think he's worth a 10, maybe a 9? Think he was an 8, a 7? Kind of what do you think he was? You plot him on your graph if you're doing the graph. If you're not, we can just make a decision out of 10. Now we're going to look at Edward. Okay, so we're going to look at Edward. So Edward was very, very good at arranging alliances with other kingdoms and other groups of people. Okay, so he married his sister to the Lord of Mercia, and so he was the King of Wessex, and he kind of brought together. That's why eventually Alfred sort of has a bit of a say over Mercia, because Edward the Elder had kind of had this alliance. So Aethelred was because it was his sister, and he married her off, and so they kind of set up that alliance. The other thing is he set up a lot of systems that the country still relies on. So he had courts to try people for their crimes. And he also said, right, we're going to organise each of the areas that I control into smaller areas called shires, and they're going to be controlled by a single person called a reeve, and they will then keep control. Okay, and he also constructed many, many fortresses to ensure his kingdom was protected. He was very, very strategic, and he also took back some of the English territories that had been taken by the Vikings, and he enabled Viking control to be weakened because he took over some of those areas that the Vikings had. So Edward, do you think, so some of you are saying he's probably about an 8 or a 9, some of you are saying that you don't like him marrying not 6 because you didn't like the idea of him marrying his sister off to make an allegiance. So Edward the Elder, but yes. Now, Aethelred. So, as I said, Aethelred was the sister, but she actually worked with her husband called Aethelflaed, Aethelred, or sometimes you see her as Aethelflaed, and with her husband, she also encouraged the attacks on the Vikings to take over areas. So although she wasn't the king, she was very, so some of you are saying you didn't like the fact that Edward the Elder married off his sister, but actually marrying off his sister, she actually meant that she could influence her husband. Okay, and with her husband, she founded Gloucester, which would become the new capital of Mercia, which had strategic positions to the River Severn. And when her husband died, she became what's known as a regent. So she sort of ruled until her husband's heir came of age, and she was really well respected. So she proved the importance of women in Anglo-Saxon Britain. Education was also important to her. She set up schools during her lifetime. She was thought to be highly educated. And as I said, she also wasn't kind of a pushover. So she defeated some raids from not only the Vikings, but also some raids that were coming from the tribes in Wales. So what would you kind of say about Aethelred? Really sort of flying the flag for women, maybe, in Anglo-Saxon Britain. Where would you plot them? And then the last one is King Athelstan. Now, Athelstan is regarded as the first king of all of Britain. And he drove the Vikings back and back and back so that Britain had more land. And he's known for forming good relationships with leaders from other countries. So he was a ruler that saw beyond Britain. He married his four sisters off to other rulers of other countries. So he basically sent them all off to various countries overseas and strengthened his allegiances there. He was really strong believer of religion, a religious believer. So he founded lots and lots of churches. And he's famous, which is why lots of you have probably heard of Athelstan, is he took back the kingdom of York from the Vikings. And he also kind of did a deal and said to the kings of Wales, you know, we won't bother you, but you have to give us money every year in order that we don't invade you, because he obviously felt a little bit quite a strong ruler. So he ended up like bullying the Welsh to give him money in order to sort of be left alone, which some might say was really calculating, and other people might said was like really not very pleasant. Yeah, he sent 4 of his sisters and he sent them all off. You go and marry that person, you go and marry that person. So what do you think they're worth? What he's worth out of 10? Do you think he was great? How do you think he compares to King Athelstan? Why do you think he's a 0? Why do we think he's a 0? What do we think? 3 for Athelstan. So I'm going to get you to put in the chat what you think. 3 for Athelstan. What do we think? Oh, you don't like Athelstan at all. Oh dear. Why don't you like Athelstan? Lots of you are saying, oh, it's been half an hour and I still love this. I thought you were going to say you still loved King Alfred. Eleanor thinks an 8. There's a lot of argument about him. A lot of argument. So what we're going to finish off. You can go and do some more research about them. Lots of you got a real problem with him sending his sisters off. Really hard to be a king, isn't it, in the Anglo-Saxon times? Right, we're going to finish by playing Hangman. You have got 10 chances. So I'm not going to draw the Hangman. I've just put 10 chances. So you've got 10 chances in order to correctly guess. So I'm going to go with the letters as I see them coming in the chat. So give me a letter and I will let you know. And if the letter isn't in it, you are going to have to, you're going to lose a life. So you've got 10 lives. So give me a letter. Right, so the first letter is a D. So well done. An A. A T. Oh no, it's no T. Lost the life. An S. No S. An E. What was that? A J. A C. No, there's no C. Hang on, you're all going really fast. An E. I think was the next one. An L. Oh man, I think you've got it. A K. An S. No, there's no S. There's definitely an R, an F. You've got it. Edward's got it. You've beat me. Lots of you have got it. I'm going to show the last 3 letters. Oliver's got it. It's King Alfred. Well done if you got that right. You beat me. Awesome, King Alfred. So give me a little heart emoji if you think King Alfred was the greatest king, and if you think it was one of the others, then you can give me a thumbs up. If you want to, you can write in the chat when I leave about who you think was the greatest king and give me some evidence. Don't forget that there is the Anglo-Saxon and Vikings planning guide, which you can download. And there's lots and lots of amazing activities in there. Yeah, I will see you next week for more Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. Lots of you are giving me heart emoji saying that you definitely think that King Alfred deserves the title great. Hopefully, if ever that comes up in a random quiz, who is the only monarch to ever have the title great, you would know. And if you ever get what is the Anglo-Saxon of an A and E need squished together, you'll know it's the redundant sound ash. And what more am I here for than to share random facts that you might find on a quiz when you're a grown-up? But I will see you probably, I feel, for like round 2 of Hangman next week, because I feel like I did a far too easy one. So I will see some of you next week for rocks and fossils. I'll see some of you tomorrow for rocks and fossils, and I will see you next week if you're joining me for more Viking and Anglo-Saxons. Have a lovely day, and I'll see you soon.